What if the government follows the law and people still feel afraid? Because across history, some of the most controversial systems weren't illegal. They were legal and normalized. Today, immigration enforcement in the United States has triggered a similar debate. When enforcement becomes faceless, when identity disappears, does legality still create legitimacy? And why are critics suddenly using words like apartheid and even the Gestapo, not to claim the same outcome, but to warn about the method? By the end of this video, you'll understand why this argument isn't really about immigration at all. It's about how power changes when people stop recognizing it. Most people assume that if something is legal, it must also be right. But legality only answers one question. Is it allowed? Legitimacy answers a different one. Do people trust it? The controversy today isn't whether immigration law can be enforced. It's whether enforcement that feels anonymous, discretionary, and fear-driven can still maintain public trust. Because once trust disappears, enforcement changes, even if the law doesn't. Immigration enforcement operates differently from most policing people recognize. Much of it runs through civil and administrative authority rather than criminal law. That distinction matters. Criminal enforcement is highly visible. There are warrants, court appearances, and familiar procedures. Administrative enforcement moves differently. Authority is broader, discretion is wider, and to the people experiencing it, outcomes can feel less predictable. Supporters argue this flexibility is necessary to enforce national law. Critics argue that wide discretion creates room for fear and mistakes. This debate intensified as enforcement increased and controversial incidents drew attention. At that point, the argument stopped being abstract. Because people don't experience enforcement as policy, they experience it as power. And once enforcement feels unpredictable, legality alone stops reassuring people. The question becomes psychological. Do people feel protected or targeted? This is where the debate becomes explosive. Agents operating in plain clothes, concealed identities, unmarked vehicles. Officials argue anonymity protects officer safety. Critics argue something else happens at the same time. In normal law enforcement, identification signals accountability. You know who holds power. When enforcement becomes anonymous, that signal disappears. And when power loses a face, fear fills the space. Even lawful enforcement can begin to feel like intimidation. That's where legitimacy starts to collapse. This is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable. Some critics reference apartheid-era enforcement, not because the systems are identical, but because of the method. Apartheid pass laws relied on documentation demands enforced through discretion and appearance. The concern raised today is structural. When enforcement depends heavily on suspicion and discretionary stops, people experience freedom differently depending on how they look. A rule can be neutral on paper and unequal in practice. And when people feel they must constantly prove they belong, legitimacy erodes. Another comparison that appears in debate is the Gestapo. This comparison is controversial and often misunderstood. The argument is not that modern democracies are the same as authoritarian regimes. The warning is about how systems change. Authoritarian enforcement often began inside legality, through secrecy, fear, and normalization. The lesson isn't outcome, it's pathway. When enforcement becomes identityless and accountability weakens, legality alone does not preserve legitimacy. Authoritarianism rarely begins by breaking the law. It begins by making fear feel procedural. Immigration enforcement has another unique feature. It can expand dramatically without changing the law itself. Eligibility priorities can widen. Detention can increase. Discretion can shrink. Everything can remain lawful, while the experience changes completely. That's why this debate exists. Because legality answers whether something can be done, not whether it should be done. This is the central idea. A system can be legal and still lose legitimacy, not because law disappears, but because discretion grows wider, consequences become harsher, and trust erodes. History shows that systems rarely announce when they cross a line. They normalize tactics first, until what once felt unusual becomes routine. So the real debate isn't whether laws should be enforced. It's what kind of enforcement a society is willing to call normal. So the question is simple. What matters more in a democracy? Maximum enforcement or maximum legitimacy? And where should the line be drawn?